It was just a sweet portrait, but look closer at the writing hidden on the wall. The storage room of the Minnesota Historical Society smelled of old paper and wood polish. Daniel Warren adjusted his white cotton gloves and carefully lifted another archival box from the metal shelf. He'd been cataloging the Bergstrom collection for 2 weeks now, a donated estate containing photographs, letters, and documents from Norwegian immigrant families who'd settled in Minnesota during the 1890s. Most items were predictable: formal studio portraits, immigration papers, land deeds. But when Daniel opened the next box, he found something that made him pause. Protected between sheets of acid-free tissue paper lay a large format photograph, remarkably well preserved despite its age. The image showed 5 people standing in front of a log cabin. The structure was clearly new, fresh-cut logs still showing their pale inner wood, a stone chimney rising from one side, glass windows that would have been a luxury on the frontier. The land around the cabin had been recently cleared, stumps still visible in the background. The family posed stiffly, as was common for photographs of that era when exposure times required absolute stillness. On the left stood a tall man, perhaps in his mid-30s, with a thick beard and work-worn clothes. Beside him was a woman wearing a simple dark dress, her hair pulled back severely. 3 children stood in front, 2 girls who looked about 7 and 9 years old, and a boy who couldn't have been more than 5. What struck Daniel immediately was the expression on the woman's face. Unlike the stern, emotionless looks typical of 1890s photography, her eyes held something else: fear, determination. He couldn't quite identify it, but it was there. He turned the photograph over carefully. Written in faded brown ink, "The Anderson Family, New Homestead, Elk River, Minnesota, September 1893. Daniel photographed the image with his high-resolution camera, part of the standard digitization process. The Historical Society's new scanner could capture details invisible to the naked eye, preserving every nuance for researchers and the public database. As he prepared the next item, his computer chimed. The first photograph had finished processing. Daniel glanced at his screen, then stopped completely. On his monitor, enlarged to fill the entire display, the photograph revealed something he hadn't noticed before. In the window of the cabin, behind the family, there appeared to be markings on the glass. Words. Daniel leaned closer to his monitor, his heart rate accelerating the way it always did when he stumbled onto something potentially significant. He zoomed in on the cabin's window, adjusting contrast and brightness to compensate for the age of the photograph and the reflection on the glass. The markings were faint, barely visible even with digital enhancement, but they were definitely there. Someone had written something on the inside of that window and the camera had captured it. He could make out individual letters, though reading them required patience and careful adjustment of the image. The writing appeared to have been done with a finger or stick in condensed moisture or dust on the glass. Temporary, meant to be seen only briefly, yet accidentally preserved forever by the photographer's lens. Daniel pulled out his notebook and began transcribing what he could see. Names, must remember: Sarah, Johann, Little. The rest was too degraded to read clearly, but even these fragments raised immediate questions. Why would someone write names on a window? And why did the visible names not match the Anderson family written on the back of the photograph? Daniel checked the time. 4:30. His supervisor, Patricia Chen, would still be in her office. He saved his work, carefully returned the photograph to its protective sleeve, and walked down the corridor to the administrative wing. Patricia looked up from her computer as Daniel knocked on her open door. Find something interesting? Potentially very interesting. He placed his laptop on her desk and pulled up the enhanced image. Bergstrom Collection, Item 47, family photograph from 1893. But look at this. Patricia studied the screen, her experienced eyes immediately catching what Daniel had found. She'd worked at the Historical Society for 23 years and had seen countless photographs, but her expression showed genuine surprise. Writing on the window, she murmured. That's unusual. Can you make out what it says? Daniel showed her his transcription. Patricia sat back, fingers drumming on her desk, her habit when thinking through a problem. The photograph is labeled as the Anderson family, but the names you can read don't match. Sarah and Johann aren't traditional Norwegian spellings. Those would be more likely to be Sarah and Johann, but even then, she trailed off, pulling up the Historical Society's database. Let me check our records for Elk River homesteaders in 1893. Patricia's fingers flew across her keyboard as Daniel pulled up a chair beside her desk. The Historical Society's database contained decades of compiled research, land records, census data, church registries, newspaper archives, all cross-referenced and digitized. "Here," Patricia said, pointing to an entry. "Anderson, Lars, claimed 160 acres under the Homestead Act in Elk River Township, May 1893. Wife deceased, 1891, Oslo, Norway. No children listed." Daniel frowned. "The photograph shows a woman and 3 children." "Exactly." Patricia clicked through several more screens. According to the land office records, Lars Anderson filed his claim alone, a widower. The Homestead Inspector's report from August 1893 notes bachelor residence, adequate improvements. But the photograph is dated September 1893, and it clearly shows a family. Patricia leaned back, her expression thoughtful. Either the records are wrong, which is possible but unlikely, Homestead inspectors were quite thorough, or something changed between August and September, something significant enough to transform a bachelor's claim into a family homestead. Daniel opened his laptop and pulled up the enhanced image again, zooming in on different sections. The woman's dress was plain but clean, not the typical sturdy work clothes of frontier women. The children wore similar simple clothing, and none of them had the sun-darkened skin common to people who'd spent months traveling west or working outdoors. "They look like they just arrived," Daniel observed. "Clean clothes, pale complexions. But if Lars Anderson came alone in May and was inspected as a bachelor in August, where did this family come from?" Patricia made a note on her pad. "We need to check several things. First, immigration records for that period. See if any families named Sarah or Johan arrived in Minnesota around that time. Second, newspaper archives. If there was some kind of incident or unusual situation involving new immigrants, it might have been reported. Third, church records. Norwegian immigrants usually maintained strong church connections. And the writing on the window," Daniel added. "Why would someone write 'must remember' with children's names? It sounds desperate." "It sounds," Patricia said slowly, "like someone was afraid those names would be forgotten." Daniel felt a chill despite the warm office. "You think something happened to them?" "I think something happened to someone, and I think this photograph might be the only evidence that survived." Patricia checked her watch. "It's almost 5. Start with immigration records tomorrow morning." "I'll reach out to our contacts at the Minnesota Land Office and see if there are any additional documents related to the Anderson homestead. Also check if that cabin still exists. Sometimes these frontier structures were preserved." Daniel arrived at the Historical Society at 7 the next morning, too intrigued to sleep well. He'd spent half the night thinking about the photograph, about the woman's fearful eyes and the desperate words scratched onto window glass. He started with Ellis Island records, though he knew most Scandinavian immigrants in the 1890s came through other ports. Within an hour, he'd shifted to records from Quebec and Boston, the primary entry points for Norwegian immigrants heading to Minnesota. The search was painstaking. Immigration manifests listed thousands of names, often with inconsistent spellings and minimal information. But Daniel had learned patience during his years as an archivist. Every historical mystery required methodical, careful research. By 10 o'clock he'd found something. A ship manifest from the SS Nor, arriving in Quebec on July 15, 1893, listed a family: Hansen, Sigrid F28, Sarah F9, Christine F7, Johan M4. The names matched. Sarah and Johan, the names written on the window, and 2 more names that might correspond to the other children in the photograph. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he searched for more information. The Hansen family had purchased rail tickets to St. Paul, Minnesota, their destination listed as Elk River District, joining family, but there was a notation in the margin, added in different ink. "See Incident Report, AUG 2, 1893. Daniel spent 20 minutes locating the referenced incident report in a different archive collection. When he finally found it, the brief, formal language couldn't disguise the tragedy it described. On August 2, 1893, a wagon carrying immigrant families overturned crossing a swollen creek 15 miles west of Elk River. The driver, attempting to ford during high water after recent storms, lost control. 3 adults drowned, including Gustav Hansen, husband and father. His wife Sigrid and their 3 children survived, rescued by another homesteader who'd heard the screams. The report noted that Sigrid Hansen had suffered a severe head injury and was in grave condition. The children were unharmed physically but severely traumatized. Daniel read the report 3 times, his mind racing. Then he pulled up the photograph again, studying the woman's face with new understanding. That wasn't just fear in her eyes. It was the look of someone who'd witnessed death, who'd nearly died herself, who was desperately trying to hold on to something fragile and precious. He printed the incident report and nearly ran to Patricia's office. She was on the phone but gestured him in when she saw his expression. "I found them," Daniel said the moment she hung up. "The family in the photograph. They're not the Andersons. They're the Hansons." Patricia read through Daniel's findings with growing intensity, her professional composure cracking slightly as she absorbed the tragedy documented in the century-old records. "So Sigrid Hansen and her children survived the wagon accident that killed her husband," Patricia summarized. "They're rescued by someone. She's gravely injured, and somehow they end up at Lars Anderson's homestead a month later." "Lars Anderson must have been the rescuer," Daniel said. "The timeline fits. The accident happened August 2nd. The homestead inspection showing him as a bachelor was early August. By September, when this photograph was taken, Sigrid and the children are living there." Patricia nodded slowly. "It makes sense. A man alone on a frontier homestead hears screams, pulls a family from a creek. The husband is dead. The wife is badly injured. The nearest doctor might have been 20 miles away. He would have had no choice but to take them in. But why are they listed as the Anderson family in the photograph's label?" Daniel asked. "And why would Sigrid write the children's real names on the window?" Patricia was quiet for a moment, her eyes fixed on the enhanced image of the writing on the glass. Then her expression changed. "Oh no." "What?" "Daniel, how severe was Sigrid's head injury? Does the report specify?" Daniel pulled up the document again. "Severe trauma to skull. Patient unconscious for extended period. Prognosis uncertain. Head injuries can cause memory loss," Patricia said quietly. "Sometimes temporary, sometimes permanent." What if Sigrid Hansen woke up after the accident unable to remember clearly? Traumatized, injured, possibly confused about what had happened. Daniel felt understanding dawn. She wrote the names on the window so she wouldn't forget them. Her own children's names. And perhaps her own name too, Patricia added. "Look at the photograph again. Really look at her face. That's not just fear or grief. That's someone fighting to hold on to their own identity." Daniel zoomed in on Sigrid's expression. Patricia was right. The woman's eyes held a desperate intensity, as if she was trying to memorize the moment, to anchor herself to reality through sheer force of will. "Lars Anderson takes in this injured woman and 3 traumatized children," Patricia continued, working through the theory. "She's confused, possibly can't remember her own name clearly. The children are too young to provide much information, and they've just watched their father drown. Lars might not have known who they really were, or he did know, but he was trying to protect them," Daniel suggested. "If Sigrid couldn't remember and the children couldn't explain, maybe he just kept them, told people they were his family, gave them his name. That would explain why the photograph is labeled Anderson family," Patricia said. "By September 1893, that's who they'd become, publicly at least." Over the next 3 days, Daniel and Patricia worked systematically through every available record, building a comprehensive picture of what had happened in the late summer of 1893. Church records from the Norwegian Lutheran congregation in Elk River provided crucial details. In September 1893, Lars Anderson had registered a family for the first time. Himself, his wife Sigrid, and 3 children, Sarah, Christine, and Johan. The pastor's notes mentioned that Sigrid had been recently ill and Lars had requested prayers for her recovery. Census records from 1900 showed Lars and Sigrid Anderson still living on the homestead with 3 children matching the ages of the Hansen children. By then, they'd apparently fully assumed their new identities. Daniel found a homestead inspection report from October 1893, just a month after the photograph was taken, where the inspector noted, "Family residence, wife and children present, adequate improvements for permanent settlement." Lars had transformed his bachelor claim into a family homestead, which entitled him to additional land and resources. But the most revealing document came from an unexpected source, the diary of a traveling missionary named Reverend Thomas Carlson, who'd visited frontier settlements in Minnesota during 1893. Patricia found the entry in the Minnesota Historical Society's manuscript collection. Reverend Carlson had visited the Anderson homestead in late September, and his private observations were far more detailed than official records. Called upon Mr. Lars Anderson today, found him caring for a woman and 3 small children, survivors of the terrible creek drowning in August. The woman, whom he calls his wife, appears to suffer greatly from her injuries. She speaks little and seems confused about her circumstances. The children are well cared for but quiet, clearly affected by their ordeal. Mr. Anderson explained that his true wife died in Norway, and he has taken responsibility for this family out of Christian duty, though he presents them publicly as his own. He fears if the truth were known, the children might be separated and sent to an orphanage, and the woman might be institutionalized for her mental confusion. I counseled him on the gravity of his deception, but I confess I cannot fault his compassion. These children need a home, and this woman needs care he seems willing to provide. Daniel read the entry aloud to Patricia, his voice catching slightly on the final sentences. So Lars knew exactly who they were, Patricia said. He deliberately chose to protect them by giving them his name. But Sigrid wrote those names on the window, Daniel pointed out. She was fighting to remember, even when everyone around her was telling her she was Sigrid Anderson. Patricia pulled up the photograph again, studying Sigrid's face. Maybe in that moment, before the photographer arrived, she had a moment of clarity. She remembered who she really was, who her children really were. And she used the only thing available, a dusty window, to leave evidence. Evidence that was accidentally preserved in a photograph, Daniel added, hidden for 131 years until digital technology made it visible. With the historical record pieced together, Daniel and Patricia turned to a question that had been lurking in both their minds. Did the cabin still exist? Land records showed the original Anderson homestead had been sold in 1924, 3 years after Lars's death. The property had changed hands several times over the decades, eventually becoming part of a larger farm. But the original cabin's location was documented in the survey maps. Daniel contacted the current property owner, a man named Robert Lindstrom, who'd inherited the farm from his grandfather. When Daniel explained what he'd discovered, Lindstrom's response was immediate. The old cabin? Yes, it's still standing. We use it for equipment storage now. My grandfather always said it should be preserved. It's one of the oldest structures in the county, but I had no idea it had such a story behind it. 2 days later, Daniel and Patricia drove 90 minutes northwest to Elk River, accompanied by a professional photographer and a preservation specialist from the Historical Society. The October morning was crisp, leaves turning gold and red across the Minnesota countryside. Lindstrom met them at the farm entrance and led them across a harvested cornfield to a stand of old-growth trees. There, partially hidden by overgrown brush, stood the log cabin. Daniel felt his breath catch. It was the same structure from the photograph, unmistakably so. The stone chimney, though weathered, still stood. The windows were intact, though covered with grime and spiderwebs from a century of neglect. We haven't changed much inside, Lindstrom explained as he unlocked the modern padlock someone had added to the original wooden door. Just cleared out some old furniture decades ago. The interior was dim, lit only by filtered light through dirty windows. The single room still had the original plank floor, rough-hewn log walls, and a cast-iron stove in one corner. Modern farm equipment was stacked along one wall, but otherwise, the space felt frozen in time. Patricia approached the window slowly, the same window visible in the 1893 photograph. The glass was original, wavy and imperfect, covered with 131 years of accumulated dust and dirt. "Daniel," she said quietly, "come look at this." He crossed the room to stand beside her. Patricia pointed to the lower corner of the window pane, where the light struck at an angle. There, barely visible beneath the dirt, were faint scratches in the glass itself, not written on the surface with moisture or dust, but actually etched into the glass with something sharp, a nail perhaps, or a stone. Daniel pulled out his phone's flashlight and shined it at an angle across the glass. The scratches became more visible, forming letters, words. Sarah Hansen, Christine Hansen, Johan Hansen. We are here. We are real. God remember us. Patricia's hand went to her mouth. Beside them, the photographer was already setting up his equipment to document the discovery. She carved it, Daniel whispered. When she realized the writing in the dust would fade, she carved their real names into the glass itself. A permanent record. A message to the future, Patricia added, hoping someone, someday, would see it and know the truth. Back at the Historical Society, Daniel worked late into the evening, compiling every piece of evidence into a comprehensive timeline. The story that emerged was both heartbreaking and beautiful. July 1893. The Hansen family, Gustav, Sigrid, Sarah, 9, Christine, 7, and Johan, 4, arrived in Quebec from Norway, traveling to Minnesota to join relatives in the Elk River area. August 2, 1893, their wagon overturned crossing a swollen creek. Gustav drowned along with 2 others. Sigrid suffered a severe head injury. Lars Anderson, working his homestead nearby, heard the screams and pulled Sigrid and the children from the water. With no doctor nearby and Sigrid unconscious, he took them to his cabin. August-September 1893. Sigrid remained in and out of consciousness for weeks. When she woke, her memories were fragmented and confused. The children, traumatized and young, couldn't clearly explain who they were or where they'd come from. Lars cared for them all, eventually realizing that presenting them as his family would give them protection and stability they otherwise wouldn't have. September 1893. A traveling photographer came through the area. Lars arranged for a family portrait, partly to document his now official family for homestead purposes, partly perhaps as a gift to Sigrid and the children. Before the photographer arrived, Sigrid experienced a moment of clarity. She remembered her real name, her children's real names. She wrote them on the window in the dust. Then, realizing that wouldn't last, carved them into the glass with a nail. The photograph captured both, the family presenting themselves as the Andersons and the hidden truth literally written behind them. 1893-1921. Lars and Sigrid lived as husband and wife, raising the 3 Hansen children as Andersons. Whether Sigrid ever fully recovered her memories is unclear from the records. They had no additional children together. Lars worked the homestead successfully. The children grew up, married, had families of their own. 1921. Lars Anderson died at age 63. His obituary mentioned his devoted wife Sigrid and 3 children, listing them all as Andersons. 1924. Sigrid sold the homestead and moved to live with her daughter Sarah, now Sarah Peterson. She died in 1931, her obituary also listing her as Sigrid Anderson. Daniel leaned back in his chair, emotionally exhausted. The Hansen family had disappeared from history, transformed into Andersons through a combination of trauma, memory loss, and one man's compassionate deception. But Sigrid had left a message, carved in glass, captured in a photograph, waiting 131 years to be seen. Sarah Hansen, Christine Hansen, Johan Hansen, we are here, we are real. God remember us. With the full story documented, Patricia made a decision that Daniel fully supported. They needed to find the descendants of the Hansen children and tell them the truth about their ancestry. Genealogical research was time-consuming but ultimately successful. Sarah Hansen, who'd lived as Sarah Anderson Peterson, had 3 children, 12 grandchildren, and numerous great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren, many still living in Minnesota. One of them was a woman named Jennifer Mitchell, a high school teacher in St. Paul. When Patricia called to explain what they'd discovered, there was a long silence on the phone. "I need to see the photograph," Jennifer finally said. A week later, Jennifer sat in the Historical Society's research room, staring at the enhanced image on a large monitor. Tears streamed down her face as Patricia explained the evidence: the immigrant records, the accident report, the missionary's diary, the writing carved in the cabin window. "My great-grandmother Sarah used to tell stories when I was little," Jennifer said quietly. "She'd talk about crossing water, about being very afraid. But she always said she couldn't remember where it happened or when. We thought they were just confused memories from an old woman. My mother said Grandma Sarah sometimes seemed uncertain about her own childhood, like she was remembering someone else's life." "She was," Daniel said gently. "She was 9 years old when her father drowned and her mother was injured. Then she spent the rest of her life being told she was Sarah Anderson, not Sarah Hansen." Jennifer wiped her eyes. "Do we know anything about Gustav Hansen, my real great-great-grandfather?" Patricia had anticipated the question and pulled out a folder. "Not much, but some. He was a carpenter from Bergen, Norway. Immigrated specifically because he'd heard there was work in Minnesota's growing towns. He wanted to build a better life for his family, and he drowned trying to get them there," Jennifer whispered. "But Sigrid survived," Patricia said, "and she made sure your great-grandmother and her siblings survived too. She might have lost her memory, but she never lost her determination to preserve their real identities. That's why she carved those names in the glass." Jennifer studied the photograph again, particularly Sigrid's face. She looked strong, afraid but strong. She was both, Daniel confirmed. Strong enough to survive a trauma that would have destroyed many people. Strong enough to raise her children even when she couldn't fully remember who she was, and strong enough to leave evidence for the future. Jennifer was quiet for several minutes, just looking at the faces of her ancestors. Then she asked, "Can I see the cabin and the window?" 3 months later, on a cold January morning, a small group gathered at the old Anderson homestead. Robert Lindstrom had agreed to donate the cabin to the Minnesota Historical Society for preservation. Today was the official dedication ceremony. Jennifer Mitchell stood with a dozen of her relatives, descendants of Sarah, Christine, and Johan Hansen, all of whom now knew their true family history. Patricia and Daniel were there, along with local historians, preservation specialists, and several reporters. The cabin had been carefully restored. The logs had been treated and stabilized, the chimney repointed, the roof repaired. But the most important element had been preserved exactly as found: the window with Sigrid Hansen's carved message. A protective, transparent panel now covered the original glass, preserving it from weather and touch while keeping the words visible. Lighting had been installed to illuminate the carving at the angle where it showed most clearly. Patricia stepped forward to address the small crowd. This cabin represents something we often forget in historical preservation: that individual lives matter, that forgotten voices deserve to be heard. Sigrid Hansen and her children became the Anderson family out of necessity, trauma, and one man's compassion. But Sigrid made sure their real names would survive, carved literally into the structure of their home. Jennifer spoke next, her voice carrying across the cold air. "My family spent generations not knowing who we really were. We were proud to be descended from the Anderson family, from pioneers who built this cabin and worked this land. Now we know there's another name we should honor: Hansen. Gustav Hansen, who died trying to give his family a better life. Sigrid Hansen, who survived and protected her children even when she couldn't fully remember her own story. And Lars Anderson, who wasn't our biological ancestor, but who gave our family the stability and protection they desperately needed." She paused, looking at the cabin. This photograph that Daniel found wasn't just a sweet portrait of a pioneer family. It was evidence of survival, of love, of the ways people take care of each other when everything falls apart. And it was proof that even when history tries to erase you, even when trauma steals your memory, even when you're given a new name and a new identity, the truth can still survive, written on glass, waiting for someone to look close enough to see it. Inside the cabin, visitors could now view both the original photograph and the enlarged image showing the writing on the window. Display panels told the full story of the Hansen and Anderson families, of the accident, of Lars's compassionate deception, and of Sigrid's desperate act of preservation. But the most powerful element was simply standing in the cabin itself, in front of that window, reading the words Sigrid had carved 131 years ago. Sarah Hansen, Christine Hansen, Johan Hansen. We are here, we are real. God remember us. God, and now history, had remembered. As the ceremony ended and people began to file inside the cabin, Daniel stood with Patricia, watching Jennifer and her relatives trace their fingers along the protective panel covering the carved words. "We almost missed it," Daniel said quietly. "If I hadn't digitized that photograph at high resolution, if the technology hadn't been good enough to show the detail in the window, Sigrid's message would have remained invisible." "But you did digitize it," Patricia replied, "and the technology was good enough. And now these people know who they really are. That's what we do, Daniel. We find the stories history tried to forget. We make invisible voices visible again." Inside the cabin, Jennifer was explaining something to her teenage daughter, both of them standing in front of the window where their ancestor had carved a desperate plea to be remembered. The message had waited 131 years, but it had finally been heard.